What if the stories you were taught about ancient conquests were only half the truth, carefully polished to hide something far more disturbing? Imagine standing inside a city that has just fallen. The gates are broken, the smoke still hangs in the air, and the soldiers who poured through the streets did not come only for territory or treasure. They came for something else, something every empire understood instinctively: the bodies and lives of the women who lived there. Because when power wanted to send a message, it spoke through them. And history, for centuries, pretended not to hear. Before the dust even settled, women became the first currency of domination. Conquered cities were not just defeated, they were humiliated through the systematic degradation of their daughters, mothers, and wives. Empires from the Near East to the Mediterranean perfected this pattern, turning women into symbols of victory and instruments of terror. And the deeper you dig into ancient records, the clearer the pattern becomes. Every city that fell wrote the same silent chapter, but almost none of it survived in the official chronicles. But why did these acts go so far? Why did commanders who had already won the war choose to unleash horrors on a population that could no longer fight back? The answer cuts deeper than strategy. To break a city completely, you didn't just topple its walls or execute its leaders. You shattered its identity, its lineage, its sense of safety. And nothing accomplished that faster than turning women into targets, trophies, warnings. This was psychological warfare at its purest, and every empire from Assyria to Rome used it because it worked. Think about it. When soldiers stormed a city, they were not acting on impulse. They were enacting a ritual older than the written word. The violence against women was deliberate, calculated, and culturally reinforced. You see hints of it in cuneiform tablets, in fragments of Greek historians, in the footnotes of medieval chronicles where scribes tried to downplay what really happened. But when you read between the lines, the truth becomes unavoidable. Women suffered the kind of brutality that even ancient writers struggled to describe, precisely because it exposed the darkest mechanism of conquest. And here's the part that should make you stop for a moment. These stories didn't vanish by accident. They were buried because they revealed the fragility of civilization itself. They exposed what power becomes when no one is left to challenge it. And if you've ever wondered why certain historical episodes feel incomplete, why entire populations appear in records only to vanish without explanation, it's because the violence inflicted on women was so extreme that chroniclers chose silence instead of truth. Before we go deeper, tell me something. Have you ever questioned how much of history was intentionally softened to protect the image of the victors? If what you're hearing now is already unsettling, stay with this story, because what comes next will show how far empires were willing to go when they believed no one would remember. If this opening made you think about how history hides its darkest truths, comment your thoughts, share your perspective, and let me know if you've ever come across a story like this before. And make sure to like this video and check whether you're already subscribed to the channel. What you're about to discover will only get more intense as we move forward, and the next part connects directly to the real machinery of domination hidden beneath ancient conquests. To understand why the violence against women in conquered cities became so grotesquely systematic, you have to look beyond the battlefield. Ancient warfare wasn't merely about seizing land or resources. It was about rewriting the identity of a people so completely that resistance became unthinkable. And women, in the eyes of every conquering power, were the most effective medium through which that transformation could be enforced. Their suffering wasn't collateral damage. It was strategy. Empires recognized something chilling early on. You don't truly dominate a population until you dominate the people who hold its cultural memory, its generational continuity, its emotional core. Women embodied all of that. They carried lineage, tradition, family honor, religious practice, and social stability. Striking at them didn't just cause pain. It destabilized the fabric of the entire community. That's why the violence wasn't random. It was ritualized, rehearsed, passed down through military custom. When invading armies crossed a city's threshold, they often had explicit orders, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied through centuries of precedent, on how to handle the female population. Commanders knew that terrorizing women would echo louder than any victory procession. It sent a message to the survivors that no corner of life was safe, no bond sacred, no boundary respected. To soldiers, it was framed as the ultimate demonstration of triumph. To leaders, it was a way to turn conquest into psychological enslavement. Ancient texts, when read carefully, confirm this pattern. The Assyrians carved reliefs showing chained women paraded before crowds. Greek chroniclers alluded to the spoils that cannot be named, a euphemism so transparent that later historians could barely pretend not to understand it. Medieval scribes wrote of women taken as the city was, taken, a phrase that hides its brutality beneath theological detachment. Even Roman records, which typically prided themselves on blunt clarity, softened their descriptions when the violence became too disturbing to justify. But the most revealing clue comes not from what is written, but from the silences. Entire populations disappear from records after conquests, leaving gaps historians can't fill with military casualties alone. Cities that suffered extreme forms of gendered violence often show demographic collapses that lingered for generations. Some sites show burial pits containing only women and children, while others reveal abandoned districts where no families rebuilt their homes. These absences speak louder than surviving chronicles ever could. And the soldiers themselves were conditioned to participate. They were taught that domination required humiliation, that loyalty to their commander was proven through brutality, that sparing a woman was weakness. In some armies, the first hours after a city fell became an unspoken test of allegiance and obedience. This wasn't chaos. It was indoctrination. A young recruit who hesitated risked shame or punishment from his own comrades, sometimes worse than anything inflicted on the conquered people. That's why these atrocities grew more inhuman generation after generation. Each empire refined the methods of the one before it. The violence became not only normalized but expected, entrenched in tradition, enforced by hierarchy, and justified through religion, mythology, or the cold logic of empire building. The women caught inside these moments didn't just lose their safety, they lost their place in the story, because the story was being written by the men who conquered them. But even within this darkness, there were patterns, specific mechanisms of control, that reveal how intentional these acts truly were. And once you see those mechanisms clearly, you begin to understand why certain episodes of history still shake the foundations of what we think we know about ancient power. When you study the aftermath of ancient conquests, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore: the systematic erasure of what happened to women. Not just the physical violence itself, but the memory of it. Empires understood that brutality alone wasn't enough. To maintain power, they needed to reshape the narrative, to bury the evidence, to ensure that the suffering of these women would never become a rallying cry for future generations. And so, the violence was followed by something just as destructive: silence. This silence wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The men who documented history were often the same men who benefited from the conquest. Scribes, chroniclers, priests, imperial historians, they all worked under rulers who needed their atrocities repackaged as divine justice, military necessity, or the natural order of civilization. In their hands, the trauma of women was transformed into vague phrases, euphemisms, or complete omissions. Entire chapters vanished because remembering them would expose the truth of how power really operated. You see the first signs of this manipulation in the language itself. Ancient Greek writers used terms like "the women were handled" or "the daughters were taken," phrases that conceal the brutality behind gentle verbs. Roman historians often reduced the suffering of thousands to a single line about customary spoils. Medieval chroniclers disguised horrors by framing them as divine punishment, conveniently avoiding who actually inflicted the violence. These records weren't just incomplete, they were crafted to mislead. And the silence becomes louder when you compare sources from different regions. Archaeological evidence often contradicts official accounts. Burned homes with women's remains found bound, mass graves containing only females, abandoned districts where households vanished in a single generation. These findings tell a story the written records refuse to acknowledge. For every sanitized sentence preserved in a royal chronicle, the ground beneath former cities holds a much darker truth. But the most revealing pattern lies in the stories that were never meant to survive. Letters hidden in monastery walls, merchant diaries smuggled out of ruined cities, legal petitions from surviving families begging leaders to intervene. These fragments show what the official histories tried to erase: that violence against women wasn't an unfortunate side effect of war. It was a deliberate tool of domination that reshaped entire societies. And the people who lived through it understood exactly what was being done to them, even if later generations were denied that knowledge. Empires also used erasure to rewrite their own moral identity. A conquering army could not be cast as heroic while acknowledging the horrors it unleashed on women. So chroniclers reframed the narrative. The conquered people became rebellious, sinful, or barbaric, implying that whatever happened to them was deserved. The more violent the conquest, the more righteous the victors claimed to be. This narrative shield protected those in power while silencing the voices of the women who suffered the consequences. And over time, the silence became tradition. Successive generations inherited a version of history that was carefully edited, polished, and stripped of its most uncomfortable truths. The violence faded from memory, replaced by myths of glorious conquest and divine destiny. Women who endured unspeakable horrors were transformed into footnotes or omitted entirely, leaving modern readers with a sanitized version of events that barely resembles what actually happened. But cracks in the official story are impossible to hide forever. As scholars piece together fragments from forgotten archives, newly translated texts, and forensic discoveries, the missing narrative begins to take shape. What emerges is a portrait of conquest in which the suffering of women was not only central, but intentionally concealed. And when you follow this thread far enough, you begin to see how deeply this silence shaped the way entire civilizations understood their past and justified their power. When ancient armies breached the walls of a conquered city, what happened next was not improvised chaos, but a ritual of domination rehearsed over centuries. The violence inflicted on women was not an eruption of uncontrolled brutality. It was a calculated ceremony that announced the new order. Soldiers understood their role in this ritual. Commanders expected it. Civilians knew it was coming long before the first enemy banners appeared on the horizon. And the women trapped inside these cities became living symbols of what happened when a world collapsed in on itself. Once a city fell, the process unfolded with horrifying precision. The first wave of soldiers targeted strategic locations and male defenders. But the second wave moved, with a different purpose. They sought out the spaces where women hid, temples converted into sanctuaries, storerooms sealed from the inside, upper rooms where families had barricaded themselves. These were not random searches. Armies knew exactly where women would flee, because every conquest before had taught them the same patterns. They had studied the psychology of fear as closely as they studied the layout of enemy fortifications. And when they found these women, a second ritual began, the stripping away not only of safety but of identity. In many societies, a woman's honor was inseparable from her family's reputation. By violating her, the conquerors violated the entire lineage. In some cultures, families would refuse to speak of their daughters again. In others, survivors were forced into servitude, displayed as trophies, or marched in victory parades. To the conquerors, this humiliation carried immense symbolic weight. It represented the final unmaking of the city's resistance. Some empires formalized the process. The Assyrians documented it in reliefs carved into palace walls. The Babylonians wrote instructions on clay tablets. The Greeks cloaked it in euphemisms, but preserved enough detail to reveal the underlying brutality. Even medieval armies, supposedly guided by Christian doctrine, enacted their own versions of the ritual, often justified through theology or vengeance. And though these cultures differed in language, religion, and political systems, their treatment of conquered women followed almost identical patterns. It was violence elevated into statecraft. What makes these episodes even more disturbing is the way commanders exploited them to cement loyalty among their troops. Allowing soldiers access to women was framed as a privilege of victory, a reward for risk, a means of binding men to their leaders through shared complicity. Once a soldier participated in the ritual, he was less likely to question authority. He had crossed a boundary that forever linked him to the conquest. Empires relied on this psychological mechanism more than they ever admitted in their official histories. The women themselves rarely appear in surviving records, and when they do, it is usually through the cold lens of administrative reports. Lists of captives, tallies of household slaves, references to the taken ones. But scattered letters, poems, and testimonies preserved in monastic archives show a different picture. They describe the moment soldiers broke through doors, the terror of being torn from family, the silence that followed when communities refused to acknowledge what had happened. These voices are fragmented, but they reveal the emotional devastation behind the ritual. And yet, for all their attempts to reduce women to symbols, conquerors often underestimated them. Some resisted in ways recorded only in whispers, refusing to be paraded, sabotaging their captors' households, preserving cultural memory through forbidden songs or prayers. Their resilience became a quiet counter-ritual, a final act of defiance inside a system designed to crush them. And though history seldom honored these acts, they shaped the hidden legacy of many conquered cities far more than the victors ever intended. But the machinery of conquest did not stop with public humiliation. There were deeper layers, increasingly inhuman, that empires tried to conceal even from their own annals. Layers that reveal how far power was willing to go to erase identity completely. And once you see how those mechanisms operated, the full magnitude of these atrocities becomes impossible to ignore. If any part of this struck you or reminded you of something you've read or studied, leave a comment sharing your reflection or interpretation. Your perspective helps uncover the layers of history that were never meant to be remembered. The moment a city fell, women became the battlefield long after the fighting had stopped. Conquest did not end with the defeat of armies. It transformed the bodies of women into instruments of punishment, deterrence, and political theater. To the victors, this was not merely an aftermath of war, but an essential stage in the collapse of a society. And every empire, regardless of its supposed values, treated women as the perfect target for delivering a message that would echo for generations. The logic behind it was cold and strategic. Women represented continuity, family line, inheritance, cultural identity. They carried traditions in their stories, rituals, and daily practices. They raised the next generation, preserved religious customs, and held communities together through crisis. So, when conquerors wanted to make sure a city would never rise again, they struck at the people who embodied that continuity. Destroying walls stopped the present. Destroying women destroyed the future. This is why the violence often went far beyond personal cruelty. It became a collective punishment intended to crush the spirit of entire populations. Some armies forced families to watch as a form of psychological disintegration, knowing that the memory would fracture trust and unity. Others turned women into warnings, displaying them in public spaces so survivors would understand what defiance cost. These acts functioned as propaganda, terror, and social engineering all at once. Archaeological evidence reveals patterns that written histories tried to erase. In multiple ruined cities, skeletal remains show signs of binding, fractures inflicted before death, and injuries consistent with intentional mutilation. Some sites contain mass graves of only women, buried without the rituals typically reserved for the dead. Others show abandoned districts where no families rebuilt, suggesting trauma so deep that people refused to return even generations later. When historians compare these findings with the sanitized accounts written by the victors, the disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. There are also records, fragmented but unmistakable, that show how conquerors turned women into tools for reshaping political order. In some empires, women from elite families were distributed among officers to legitimize new power structures. In others, forced marriages were imposed to dilute cultural identity. Sometimes entire female populations were relocated, transported as human trophies meant to repopulate loyal territories and weaken the conquered region's demographic base. The body became a border, a weapon, a hostage. Yet the psychological purpose was even more insidious. By targeting women, conquerors corrupted the emotional core of the society they had defeated. Fathers who could not protect daughters, husbands who could not protect wives, brothers who survived only to witness their families destroyed. The shame imposed on men was as intentional as the suffering inflicted on women. This created a long-term paralysis that made rebellion less likely, not because the people lacked anger, but because they were shattered from within. And the cruelty fed itself. Soldiers desensitized by war embraced the violence because it affirmed their dominance, validated their loyalty, and offered an outlet for the fear that conquest created in them. Commanders encouraged it because a brutalized population was easier to control. States allowed it because it reinforced the myth of invincibility on which their power depended. The cycle became so entrenched that even societies considered civilized praised warriors who enacted these horrors, celebrating them as heroes while ignoring the human cost. But beneath the official silence, the truth persisted in the margins, in letters smuggled between survivors, in oral traditions whispered across generations, in quiet absences where names should have been recorded but never were. These fragments reveal a hidden history in which the suffering of women was not incidental, but central to the machinery of domination that shaped the ancient world. In every conquered city, there were women who refused to disappear into the script written for them. Their resistance did not always look like rebellion in the traditional sense, and rarely did it involve weapons. Instead, it took the form of choices made in silence, decisions forged under unimaginable pressure, and small acts of defiance that empires tried desperately to erase from the record. These stories survived only in fragments, but together, they reveal a truth that official histories never intended to preserve. Even in the darkest conditions, women found ways to resist. Some of these women were members of elite families, taught from childhood how to navigate political structures and read the intentions of powerful men. When the city walls fell, they understood immediately what would follow. Instead of waiting, they hid sacred objects, destroyed genealogies that could be used to track surviving relatives, or smuggled children through secret passages long before soldiers breached the gates. Their actions, often carried out in a matter of minutes, determined who would remain alive after the initial chaos. Many were captured or killed, their stories silenced before they were ever recorded. Others resisted through refusal. When forced into servitude, some women refused to speak the conqueror's language, refused to participate in rituals meant to erase their identity, or refused to comply with the roles imposed on them. chroniclers often described these women as difficult or unmanageable, coded language that masks the reality of their resistance. In some cases, their acts were so disruptive that commanders separated them from the general population, fearing they might spread defiance among others. These quiet rebellions rarely survived in written accounts, but they appear in letters and testimonials written years later by witnesses who never forgot the courage they saw. There were also women who used the conqueror's own system against him. In societies where women could gain positions in households, palaces, or administrative centers, they sometimes became conduits for information, passing secrets to surviving families or influencing decisions in ways that undermined the new regime. Their actions were subtle: misfiled documents, altered messages, small acts of sabotage that disrupted supply lines or slowed military orders. These forms of resistance left almost no trace in official archives, but the consequences appear in unexplained delays, failures, and administrative mistakes recorded by frustrated commanders. Some women chose a different path: the preservation of memory. Even when stripped of everything familiar, they carried their culture in songs, prayers, stories, and rituals that conquerors dismissed as harmless. But these traditions became a lifeline for the next generation, keeping alive a version of the past that empires tried to extinguish. Archaeologists have found fragments of these traditions, encoded in pottery patterns, burial practices, and whispered oral histories that survived long after written documents disappeared. This form of resistance was not loud, but it was lasting. And then there were the women whose stories survived because they were meant to be warnings. Empires recorded their defiance only to highlight the consequences. Some chroniclers described women who attacked soldiers with whatever they had: a kitchen blade, a stone, a burning torch, fully aware of the punishment. These accounts were framed as examples of madness or excessive pride, terms used to delegitimize their courage. But when you strip away the propaganda, what remains is a portrait of human beings who chose dignity over survival in a world designed to break them. The tragedy is that most of these women remain unnamed. They appear only in the margins, described indirectly, mentioned briefly, or reduced to symbols. Yet their fragmented stories challenge the narrative that conquered. Populations submitted passively to domination. Their acts, however small or desperate, reveal a pattern of resilience that empires could damage but never fully extinguish. And it is in these hidden acts of defiance that the true emotional history of conquest takes shape, forming a counter-narrative that was not meant to be remembered, but endured nonetheless. The brutality inflicted on women in conquered cities did not emerge from chaos or spontaneous cruelty. It was the predictable output of a machine, an imperial system engineered to break populations by targeting the people least able to protect themselves. Empires learned quickly that domination was most effective when it was organized, standardized, and repeated across every territory they absorbed. And so the violence became procedural, carried out with the same cold efficiency as tax collection or census taking. Women became the first layer of that machinery, and their suffering was woven into the operational logic of conquest. At the heart of this system was a simple truth: terror had to be reliable. Commanders could not depend on individual soldiers acting independently. They needed practices that created uniform fear no matter the city, culture, or era. This is why, from Mesopotamia to the medieval kingdoms, nearly identical patterns appear in records separated by centuries. Armies were taught where to sweep first, how to isolate women, how to divide captives into categories, and how to inflict maximum psychological damage with minimal effort. It was not improvisation, it was protocol. Women from elite families were often taken first, not because they were the easiest targets, but because they represented political continuity. Removing them disrupted dynastic lines, inheritance rights, and the legitimacy of surviving leaders. The rest of the female population was processed like inventory, with forced labor, forced servitude, and sexual violence functioning as tools for reshaping a conquered society. Each step reinforced the message that resistance was pointless. This was not about individual soldiers asserting dominance. It was the empire asserting ownership. What makes this machinery even more disturbing is how thoroughly it infiltrated the administrative structures of the conquering powers. You see it in lists of captives organized by age and marital status, in records of women assigned as gifts to officers, in transport logs that treat human lives as shipments, even in religious texts that rationalize the destruction of foreign women as divine instruction or moral cleansing. The violence was not hidden from the system, it was embedded in it. It justified itself through bureaucracy, tradition, and ideology. Empires also understood the long-term effects of this violence. By weaponizing women's suffering, they created generations of trauma that weakened communities from within. Survivors were often stigmatized, excluded, or forced into silence by their own people. This internal collapse served the conqueror's interests better than any standing army could. A fractured society could not rebuild its political unity or recover its cultural strength. The empire did not need to patrol every street. It simply had to let the wounds fester. And the soldiers themselves were shaped by this system. Young recruits learned quickly that participating in brutality was both a rite of passage and a measure of loyalty. Those who hesitated were shamed or punished, conditioning them to obey without questioning the morality of their orders. Over time, the violence became self-perpetuating. The machine did not need constant supervision. It sustained itself through social pressure, reward systems, and the normalization of cruelty. Yet even within this structure, there were moments where cracks appeared, instances where women disrupted the machinery through resistance, refusal, or survival. These moments were small, often erased, but they exposed a truth that empires never admitted. Domination was never absolute. Even the most efficient system of oppression depended on fear, and fear was never perfect. And it is precisely in these moments that the next part of this story finds its roots, because the machinery of conquest did not just operate in the open, it also tried to conceal what it had done. If any part of this exposed something you hadn't realized about how empires worked, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your perspective helps uncover layers of history that were never meant to be seen. Once conquest became routine, empires discovered that terror did not need to be spontaneous to be effective. It could be staged, choreographed, and displayed as a political message. The violence inflicted on women was not only a tool of control within the conquered city, it was a signal broadcast outward to every kingdom watching. Leaders understood that cruelty, when made visible, could travel farther than armies and do more damage than any siege engine. And so the suffering of women became a form of communication, a message carved into the collective memory of entire regions. Rulers used these displays deliberately. When an empire wanted to discourage rebellion in surrounding territories, they showcased the most shocking outcomes of resistance. Reports of what happened to women circulated faster than news of battles, carried by merchants, refugees, and spies. Commanders knew this. They relied on it. A single atrocity in one city could prevent uprisings in 10 others, sparing armies the cost of future campaigns. Violence became a political investment, and women were its most potent currency. Ancient correspondence confirms this pattern. Letters between generals describe making an example of female captives so neighboring rulers would think twice before defying imperial authority. Chronicles from distant regions speak of cities surrendering without a fight because they had heard what happened elsewhere. Even diplomatic treaties reference the mercy shown to the women, a phrase used only when a city complied before the first blow was struck. The implication was clear. Refusal brought consequences that diplomats were too cautious to write explicitly. But the most revealing examples come from leaders who mastered psychological warfare. Some rulers intentionally spared women in one city just to highlight the brutality they displayed in another. This contrast amplified fear, proving the conqueror could be unpredictable, merciful one day and monstrous the next. The message to future enemies was simple. Compliance brought safety, resistance brought devastation. Women's bodies became the medium through which this lesson was delivered. There were also theatrical elements to these warnings. Certain armies staged public rituals in which women from conquered cities were displayed before crowds, not as individuals, but as symbols of what defiance produced. Their humiliation was meant to seep into the imagination of rival states. The conqueror did not need to invade every city. He only needed everyone to believe he would. Terror became a form of diplomacy, and the suffering of women became the proof. This strategy was so effective that it outlived the empires that invented it. Medieval conquerors copied the methods of Assyrian kings. Central Asian warlords adopted practices recorded centuries earlier in Western chronicles. Even when cultures claimed moral or religious superiority, the underlying playbook remained the same. Conquer through fear, signal through cruelty, and target women to magnify the psychological impact. What makes this even more disturbing is how deeply these stories penetrated cultural memory. Myths, poems, and oral traditions across continents preserve depictions of women as spoils of war, not because these were isolated events, but because they were foundational to how people understood power. A city's destruction was never just military. It was familial, generational, intimate. Women bore the consequences so vividly that entire civilizations reshaped their concepts of safety, honor, and identity around the fear of what conquerors could do. And while official records softened these accounts, the fear remained. The mere possibility of such brutality influenced decisions long before armies reached the gates. Cities surrendered early, populations evacuated, leaders negotiated desperate treaties. In this way, the violence inflicted on women extended. Beyond the individuals who suffered it, it reshaped geopolitics, guided diplomacy, and altered the course of wars without a single sword being drawn. For centuries, the most disturbing truths about what happened to women in conquered cities survived only in fragments, buried in layers of ash, sealed behind collapsed walls, or hidden in documents never meant for public eyes. Official histories rarely admitted what truly occurred. Chroniclers softened the language, rulers censored reports, and priests reframed events to protect the sanctity of the victorious. But the earth remembers what the pen tries to forget. And when archaeologists and historians began piecing together the evidence, a different narrative emerged, one far darker than the sanitized versions preserved in the chronicles. In the ruins of several ancient cities, researchers uncovered mass graves containing exclusively women and children, many showing signs of binding, fractures inflicted before death, and injuries, consistent with ritualized violence. These findings contradicted written accounts that claimed a city had been spared or treated with customary mercy. In one site, a collapsed cellar revealed the remains of nearly 30 women huddled together, suggesting they had sought refuge in the final moments before soldiers breached the doors. Their positioning told a story the conquerors never recorded. Other discoveries were even more unsettling. Clay tablets marked with administrative seals listed female captives by age, marital status, and reproductive potential, classified with the same precision used for livestock. In some medieval archives, scholars found references to unrecorded women, a deliberate omission category used when the details of their fate were considered politically dangerous. These euphemisms were designed to obscure, but their very existence confirms what the official histories refuse to name. Hidden correspondences between merchants, monks, and minor officials paint an even bleaker picture. Letters smuggled out of besieged cities described scenes too horrific for public record. Women dragged into temples, young girls taken as trophies to demonstrate victory, entire female populations executed to impose terror before rival territories. These accounts survived only because they were never intended for the eyes of kings or chroniclers. They were private confessions of people who had witnessed something they could not bear to forget. Even more revealing are the documents that disappeared entirely. Gaps in city records, missing census rolls, and abrupt demographic collapses indicate episodes of violence far greater than those described in the surviving texts. When an entire generation of women vanished from the record within a single year, the explanation was rarely written. It was erased. But the absence speaks louder than any official account. Archaeologists have also found symbols etched into hidden walls, crosses, poems, fragments of, names, left behind by women who had been imprisoned or enslaved after their cities fell. These inscriptions, carved with pottery shards or fingernails, reveal a struggle to hold on to identity while every system around them tried to erase it. The conquerors never intended these marks to be found. Yet centuries later, they emerged as the only surviving testament of lives swallowed by violence. Even diplomatic records inadvertently preserve clues. Treaties negotiated after conquests mention population adjustments, female resettlements, or restorations of honor, vague phrasing that, when translated carefully, points to mass displacement and forced assimilation. The language is clinical, sanitized, almost bureaucratic, but beneath it lies the shadow of policies designed to weaponize the bodies and futures of conquered women. And as modern historians began connecting these fragments, bones, letters, ruins, coded records, a hidden map of suffering emerged, showing that the atrocities were not isolated acts, but a recurring pattern across continents and centuries. The silence of the official histories was not an oversight, it was a strategy. By erasing the women's stories, empires preserved their own glory and masked the true cost of their victories. Yet the evidence that remains refuses to stay buried, and when seen together, it reveals the full magnitude of a violence that shaped civilizations long after the battles ended. The legacy of what happened to women in conquered cities did not fade with the fall of those empires. It seeped into the cultural memory of entire civilizations, shaping how societies understood power, fear, and identity for centuries afterward. Families carried the trauma across generations, sometimes through whispered stories, sometimes through complete silence, each approach revealing a different kind of wound. The violence left marks not only on individuals, but on entire lineages, creating fractures that reappeared long after the armies themselves had vanished. This legacy affected how communities rebuilt themselves. In many places, the demographic collapse created by mass killings, forced relocations, or enslavement meant that traditional social structures could never fully recover. Cities rebuilt on top of ruins often carried a strange emptiness, a gap in the continuity of names, families, and traditions. These absences were not just statistical, they were emotional voids, reminders of women who should have been part of the community but were erased by conquest. And even when survivors attempted to restore their cultural identity, the scars altered how future generations viewed security, honor, and vulnerability. The psychological impact endured even longer. The fear of what conquerors might do became embedded in myths, folklore, and religious practices. Entire belief systems developed around protecting women, controlling women, or isolating women, not out of moral principles, but out of inherited terror. In some regions, patriarchal structures hardened in direct response to earlier invasions, creating social systems built not on ideology, but on trauma. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of ancient conquest, the way violence against women reshaped gender norms, family dynamics, and cultural expectations for centuries. These echoes can still be detected in legal codes, inheritance customs, and marriage practices that emerged long after the original conquests. Anthropologists have traced certain restrictions, rituals, and taboos back to societies that lived through catastrophic invasions, suggesting that the trauma of those events was never fully resolved. Even today, historians find hints of this legacy in the stories families refuse to tell, in the silences preserved in local folklore, and in the fragments of narratives passed down as warnings rather than memories. The emotional architecture of entire cultures was built around surviving something too devastating to directly acknowledge. Yet the most revealing part of this legacy is how thoroughly history tried to distance itself from it. Modern readers often imagine ancient conquests as battles of strategy and heroism, forgetting the human cost that made those victories possible. But when the evidence is examined closely, a different picture emerges, one in which the suffering of women was not a footnote, but a defining force that shaped the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world. Understanding this does not rewrite history. It restores the parts that were intentionally stripped away. And as you look at these patterns, the question becomes unavoidable. How many of our modern assumptions about civilization, power, and morality are built on a foundation of stories that were never told? The silence surrounding these women was not just an omission. It was a distortion that shaped how entire societies understood themselves. And recognizing that silence is the first step toward seeing the ancient world as it truly was, rather than as the conquerors wanted it to be remembered. If you stayed with me through all of this, leave a comment saying something like, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you reached this final part. And if this journey opened your eyes to a side of history that's rarely discussed, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive. A like on this video also helps keep these hidden stories alive. And if you want to continue exploring the darker layers of the ancient world, there's another video right here that expands on everything we uncovered today. Click it and come with me there.